All right. Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to be here today, and I appreciate you all sticking with me as the last talk before lunch. I'm Danica Dillion. I'm a postdoc at Complexity Science Hub in Ohio State University. I'm going to be sharing some strategies our team has been working on to improve LLM alignment with human moral judgments. AI is entering deeply moral domains. People are turning to AI for legal advice, companionship, religious guidance, and therapy. And this makes AI alignment deeply important. AI alignment is the process of getting AI aligned with the interests and values of people. And the stakes for AI alignment are really high. On the one hand, misaligned AI can bring about more social atomization, warping our shared reality. It can risk perpetuating biases and existential risk on the extreme end. And on the other hand, if we get this right, there are potential benefits of aligned AI, like supporting quick moral decisions, like triage decisions, supporting innovation, like biomedical discoveries, increasing crop yields, potentially boosting access to support in underserved areas, and supporting complex global coordination problems. And so I like to think of alignment as really requiring three key steps. First, AI has to, quote unquote, understand or model people's values. We then have to have some form of decision-making process to account for moral pluralism and aggregate these into concrete decisions that AI follows. And then, of course, AI has to actually listen and follow those values. So this is where we get into issues of like AI blackmailing researchers. But today I'm really gonna focus on this first step, my main area of study. How well can AI model people's values, and what are the main limitations there? And then, how can we address those limitations? So how well can AI model people's values? Well, morality is nuanced and contextual. And as we all know, computer programs traditionally really struggle with nuance and context. Then LLMs came about. And very quickly, once GPT-3 and soon after ChatGPT were released, people started using LLMs for things that take a lot of nuance, things like writing essays, medical advice, therapy. And so we wondered at this time, okay, how well then can LLMs model morality? And when we first tested this in 2023, we followed a pretty simple procedure. We took previously rated scenarios, moral scenarios, for participants in the US, and aggregated them, and then we looked at the correspondence with GPT's moral judgments of the same scenarios. And we found a really high correlation between the two of 0.95. We've since replicated this study with scenarios that the model couldn't have previously seen, found a similarly high correlation of 0.92. So this, it's promising. It suggests that LLMs can model moral judgments from their training data relatively well, especially when you consider that before this major change in our world, a lot of people doubted that AI could ever model morality at all. On the flip side, though, of course, there are important limitations. I'm going to be focusing on just a couple of them that we've recently been working on. That AI uses very different processes than people to arrive at moral judgments, and that AI generally struggles to capture moral variance as opposed to central tendencies. So to this first point, AI clearly has very different cognitive architecture than people. It makes decisions with very different processes. This can lead to misalignment. AI is really a black box. So on top of it having a different cognitive architecture, even leading researchers working on AI couldn't tell you precisely how it makes each decision it makes. It's just too complex. And so we wondered in this work, could we make AI's decisions more cognitively aligned with the way that people make moral decisions? Of course, we're not going to get under the hood and change the complete way that AI works and make it work exactly like the human mind, but maybe we can add a layer on top of guiding AI to make moral decisions a bit more like people do. Okay, so how do people make moral decisions? There's been a lot of great theorizing in this area, different moral theories of how we arrive at moral decisions. One parsimonious theory is the theory of dyadic morality, which posits a cognitive template in which an agent, someone capable of acting, harms or helps a moral patient, someone who's capable of being affected, of experiencing joy and suffering. And this template is kind of nice for training AI in that you can move the levers of these different factors that implicitly shape people's moral judgments to try to get AI to consider these factors as well. So that's what we did. We asked, okay, could we use the cognitive template of the theory of dyadic morality to help make LLM decisions more cognitively aligned with the way people make moral decisions? First, we wanted to see, do people even think this would be worth doing? We described a highly cognitively aligned AI model and a lowly cognitively aligned model, and we asked people how much they would trust this model and feel comfortable with it. And we found that they thought they would trust it a bit more and feel a bit more comfortable using it. So we said, okay, let's try this. We turned to a procedure or a method in computer science known as a bottleneck model. So bottlenecks are used when you want to make some kind of categorization judgment. Let's say I want an AI to tell me what bird species this is. Normally, I just ask it for the species and I check the answer. But with a bottleneck, first I'm going to introduce some intermediate concepts relevant to that category. I ask the model, okay, first tell me the wing color, the undertail color, the beak length, and then tell me the bird species. And this does a couple things. First, if I disagree with the AI's categorization judgment, maybe I can go back and see where it's getting things wrong, and then I can correct, let's say, the beak length to try to get better answers in the future. But also, researchers have found that oftentimes just introducing these intermediate questions can improve the AI's final answer without providing any additional data or information. So we thought, okay, let's try that with morality. Let's try a moral bottleneck. We give the AI a scenario, like how moral is it to turn on the blender at 3 a.m.? And instead of just asking for the morality right away, let's take a theory of morality and then create these intermediate steps. Okay, how harmful was the situation? How vulnerable were the people affected? How intentional was the action? And how helpful was the action? And you could do this with different moral theories or concepts. And then afterwards, the model rates the morality. This is all like a simple prompting strategy. This is just adjusting the prompt. And then we compared this bottleneck model to a baseline where we just asked for the moral score. We tried this with 6 different moral frameworks. The first 3 here are psychologically grounded frameworks. The last 3 are philosophical frameworks. We tried this with 6 different models. And then we conducted 2 participant studies, one to establish a ground truth on moral scores, and then these intermediate scores about harmfulness, helpfulness, etc. And then afterwards, we also ran a trust and transparency study where we asked participants about their thoughts on the bottleneck versus the baseline model. So how cognitively aligned was the bottleneck model? Again, I can't look under the hood and tell you precisely how the model was making the decisions, but what we can do is we can see how much are these intermediate factors predicting the moral score, or how much variance are they explaining? And so we looked at the R-squared value. And we found that the intermediate dyadic morality steps explain most of the variance in the model's moral scores, which suggests that this is adding kind of a layer of interpretability and potentially, adjustability to the model's decisions. As far as alignment with the individual factors, we found that models tended to be more aligned on harm and helpfulness scores. This varied depending on the model. And this is important because dyadic morality posits that harm and the inverse help are really kind of the core of moral judgments. With intentionality and vulnerability, models were a little less aligned, and we think, looking at the scores, it seems to be that models are post-trained to think that people should be treated as like more vulnerable and maybe a little less intentional, but that's speculative. We don't know exactly why these scores are different, so it shows fairly high alignment depending on the model, but also room for improvement. Okay, but the core question: how morally aligned were the models, the bottleneck versus the baseline, with people's moral scores? We found that bottlenecks had lower mean squared errors than the baseline, suggesting better moral alignment from this simple prompting intervention. Bottlenecks had significantly lower absolute error in 31 out of the 36 model theory combinations, and they never had significantly worse error. So it seems like this is improving moral alignment. And then bottlenecks grounded in psychological theory did particularly well. They beat the baseline and the non-psychological framings. We also did kind of a small test on participant level moral responses, so asking the model now, okay, generate moral responses for particular participants. The bottleneck also produced less error with these. And then later we wanted to see, would this produce better alignment with chain of thought included for both the baseline and the bottleneck. Bottleneck is kind of similar to chain of thought, and that chain of thought is having the model reason about a scenario first, but we found that the bottleneck improved alignment above and beyond chain of thought. In other words, if you have the baseline have chain of thought and the bottleneck still added additional value. And then we did see some variation depending on the model theory combo. That just means, if you're to implement a bottleneck, you'd want to test which theory works best with the model you're using. What do people think? We described the bottleneck model and the baseline model and asked people, their thoughts on each. And people thought that the bottleneck model sounded more moral, more transparent, and more trustworthy than the baseline model, suggesting that people really are, valuing this cognitive alignment. So this suggests that bottleneck models can help LLMs be more aligned with people's beliefs and their processes to reach them. And that just trying to kind of nudge models towards following some of the same processes that people use to make moral decisions can improve their alignment. I think kind of zooming out, it also shows how social science can be valuable for AI alignment. That, since alignment has two sides, people and models, trying to work on, both sides of how do people make moral decisions, how can we get models more aligned with those decisions, really needs to be a collaborative process. So I'm excited to be seeing more and more of that. Okay, so I've shared a method that can kind of help push AI towards making moral judgments with more similar processes to people that seems to improve their alignment. Next. Another problem, AI tends to struggle to capture moral variance. So this graph captures that nicely. LLMs tend to go towards central tendencies and capture those fairly well oftentimes, but then struggle to capture variance. So here you can see an example where GPT is pretty close to the mean here, but the distribution is much narrower than it is for every age group. We see this again and again with lots of traits. But the thing is, a lot of past papers that have found this result used a method that I'll call repeated sampling. So here you take a question. We can do, you keep your neighbors up late with turning on the blender at 3 a.m. And then I just ask that question again and again. I take those different scores, and then I form the distribution. Usually you amp up the temperature of the model to try to get more variation. But the thing is that with this method, you wouldn't really expect a lot of variation because each time you're asking that question, even with high temperature, the model's trying to give you the next most likely answer. There isn't really anything in this method that's telling it, okay, I'm trying to get a full distribution. And so a similar method that's tried to kind of address this problem is persona prompting. So this time, each time I ask the model the question, I'm also going to give it demographic information about each participant in my sample. And this has had mixed results. It does tend to improve capturing a full distribution. But the thing is, you kind of need a lot of information about each individual person that goes beyond persona prompting to get good results, like 2 hours of interview data, for instance. With just persona prompting by itself, you still see that models tend to collapse variation, even with improvement. So we wondered, what if we ask models about the distribution directly? Oftentimes we're asking questions that are kind of implicitly getting at the mean, what's the answer here? But if I just ask the model, what's the standard deviation of this distribution, how good is it going to do at capturing that? And you could do this with, all sorts of characteristics of a distribution. You could ask about skewness, the number of peaks, et cetera. So we were curious to test this. I looked at past literature. I was wondering, has anyone done this before? And some people have used an even more precise method of asking for the proportion of respondents in each response band. So what percent of people answered 1, what percent answered 2, et cetera. So we wanted to try, with inspiration from this method, some different prompting strategies to improve distributional modeling. We did this with rewarded scenarios from a previous moral belief paper from our team. And then we also did this with an international data set, the ISSP Family and Changing Gender Roles module, which covers 32 countries and was also published after the training data end date of the models we looked at. So we looked at two kind of traditional methods of repeated sampling and persona prompting. We looked at the proportions method, asking the model the percent of participants in each bin in a response. And then we tried three what I'll call kind of moment-based methods. So we asked the model for the mean and standard deviation. We asked it for some other moments in the distribution. And then we also did a hybrid where we weighted the proportions from the proportion response by the mean and standard deviation answers of the model to see if this could, improve alignment, in some cases even more. Okay, so how accurate were these strategies? Here's the first 4 questions from the ISSP dataset. These are human responses. Here's repeated sampling and persona prompting. You can see they're, again, a lot narrower. But now with these distributional methods, we're getting a lot closer to the full human distributions. And when we looked at measures of distributional alignment, TVD, EMD, and JSD, that's indeed what we found, that all of the distributional methods outperform repeated sampling and persona prompting, getting us a lot closer to those human distributions, albeit not perfectly, right? And again, with the scenario data set, we saw a similar story where you can see here, they're not always getting the distribution perfectly, of course, but on average, across all the scenarios, we found that distributional prompting really improved models' ability to capture moral variance here. Which method did the best depended on the model. The newest model we tested, GPT-5, did the best with just a straight proportions method. So it seems better able for that really granular method of guessing the percent of respondents in each bin. Across the board, the hybrid actually tended to do the best. So weighting those proportions by the mean and standard deviation. And then some smaller models didn't do so well with the proportion answers and kind of struggled to come up with responses that were legible. And so for them, I think Quint32b was one, the mean and standard deviation prompt did the best. So again, if you're implementing this, kind of test it out with the model you're looking at. But overall, distributional methods seem to help models better capture moral diversity. So this just points to, thinking about the questions we're asking, and then if we're working on models, the system prompts that are underlying the model and how best to design those to better capture moral diversity. But as past work has found, and like we talked about in Lyle's talk, we did find that performance varied by country. So across the board for every country, the distributional methods worked the best, but overall performance varied by country. So this points to the fact that beyond just capturing, distribution within a population, LLMs also need to capture moral diversity cross-culturally in between social groups. That's because, AI is global. 85% of ChatGPT users outside of the US, so it's really important that alignment, reflects this. And LLM training data is really limited. It's estimated that 60 to 80% of AI model training data is Western originating. So this is a problem because LLM morals are biased towards Western populations. So I wanted to share with you a really new project our team is working on to address this, the Global Virtues Atlas. We're collecting, as many survey responses as we can on people's moral beliefs and their preferences for AI, and then using this to try to train models to better capture moral diversity. So if you're interested in this project, please feel free to get in touch. We'd love to expand our network of collaborators. Okay, so we've identified ways to, help AI with capturing moral variance, although limitations persist. And so I think, altogether, this just shows that, we're dealing with LLMs that have very different minds, quote unquote, than our own. And a lot of alignment, trying to get these AIs aligned with us, is going to be, testing different, methods to get them, which questions to ask, how to best design system prompts. And so that takes a lot of collaboration between social scientists, people in the AI industry. And the methods I've shared with you are very simple prompting strategies, right? And so I think that just shows there's promise to try relatively simple methods to improve alignment. And so with that, I want to say a huge thank you to all my collaborators, and thank you for our organizers for organizing this conference. Thank you all for your attention.
All right. Questions? I'm going to run into the back of the room here.
Cool. Hi, thank you. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the human judgments that you're aligning to. And I'm asking because I can imagine a spectrum of different things that you might want to align to. On one end, it would be quick intuitive judgments about these scenarios that people give in a survey. At the other end of the spectrum might be something more like people's more considered judgments after, say, some facilitated ethical deliberation and exposure to alternative perspectives.
Yeah, that's a great question. The work that I've shared today is with fairly simple moral scenarios. You know, how moral is it to save someone's life on an extreme end, or how moral is it to cheat on a test? The ISSP data set was similar, fairly simple questions. But we would, of course, like to extend to more complex dilemmas. And like you said, there's a question of, more deliberative reasoning, right, and aligning models with that. And so the kind of last project I shared with you, the Global Virtues Atlas, we're aiming to have people give more like free deliberative responses on moral dilemmas that are more open-ended in order to better align models with the way people are kind of thinking about the complexities of moral reasoning. I'm excited also about research that looks at different people kind of talking together and deliberating about moral issues, because I think that's really promising for model alignment as well.
Hey, great talk. I was curious about, we started off with AI has to understand and then choose and then listen. And I see that this was the understanding part, and it does a good job with some help with prompting in capturing the variation in the moral values that we see in society. And I'm curious about your thoughts on what would it mean to choose from that now that we have this whole variation that it can capture. What does AI choosing moral values mean or look like?
Yeah, it's such a tricky problem, and it's like the problem that governments have faced for thousands of years, right? If you have thousands or millions or billions of people, then how do you make decisions that's like best for everyone, given everyone has different views? And now AI companies are really struggling with that decision too. So our team's main goal is like, let's just figure out what those views are first. Let's get that data, because that's already a big gap. But then I'm also kind of excited to work with more like decision theorists, people who are experts in different methods of voting, test different voting methods to like aggregate these views. And then you could imagine like doing validation tests, like let's take models that are using different aggregation methods, and now let's look at their outputs, and let's have people rate those outputs to see what kind of aggregation method is getting to answers that the most people agree with. So I think there will never be like one right answer, quote unquote, in any decision, but hopefully we can find processes that work, the best for as many people as possible.
All right. Thank you, Danica.
Thank you.